The city wore rain like a widow's veil, a damp, persistent shroud that muted its sounds and blurred its hard edges. Within the hallowed, echoing halls of the Grayson Museum, the downpour was nothing but a distant whisper against vaulted glass. Here, the air was cool, dry, and smelled of dust and antiquity. Raina Foster moved through it with a familiar, quiet gravity, her low heels clicking a soft, solitary rhythm on the marble floors. At 28, she was the museum's youngest curator of European antiquities, a woman whose external composure was a masterful canvas over a subsurface of old, quiet grief. A decade had done little to fill the void left by her parents, it had only taught her how to walk alongside it, how to let the scholarly pursuit of long-dead histories distract from the unresolved mystery of her own. Her current preoccupation was a newly acquired 16th-century Venetian dagger, its blade etched with intricate, almost poetic patterns that belied its purpose. She was meticulously adjusting the lighting in its display case when a shift in the atmosphere of the room announced a new presence. It was not a sound, but a settling of silence, a focusing of energy. She turned. He stood a few feet away, studying a display of Renaissance-era dueling pistols. Darius Thorne. Even if she hadn't recognized him from the society pages and financial journals, she would have felt him. He was a man built from contradictions, impeccably tailored in a charcoal suit that spoke of quiet wealth, not loud excess, yet he carried a physical density that seemed to bend the space around him. His posture was relaxed, but it was the relaxation of a predator utterly sure of its territory. His face was all sharp angles and deliberate control, save for his eyes, which were a remarkable, piercing shade of gray, like polished flint. They were currently absorbing every detail of the pistol's firing mechanism with an intensity that felt more intimate than academic. A brutal elegance, isn't it? His voice was a low baritone, smooth and measured, cutting through the museum's hush without effort. He didn't turn to look at her, his gaze still fixed on the weapon. The craftsmanship devoted to perfecting an instrument of such finality. It suggests a culture that viewed death as a form of art. Raina, momentarily thrown by being addressed, found her professional footing. Or one that needed to aestheticize its violence to make it palatable to its nobility. The etching isn't just for beauty, it's a narrative. A story the wielder carried into the duel. Now, he turned. Those flint-gray eyes swept over her, not with the casual appraisal she was sometimes subjected to, but with a focus that was nearly tactile. It was as if he was cataloging her, the intelligent light in her own eyes, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the simple twist of her dark hair. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. A curator's perspective. You see the justification, not just the jewel. I see the context, Mr. Thorne. It's my job. Darius, please. He took a step closer. The air between them seemed to thicken. And you are Raina Foster. I've read your monograph on Medici-era ceremonial armor. Your thesis on the symbolism of the embossed figures was compelling. You have a knack for seeing the motive behind the metal. Nobody outside of academic circles had ever referenced her work. A flutter, part alarm, part undeniable pleasure, stirred in her chest. I'm surprised a man of your enterprises has time for obscure historical treatises. Understanding how power was adorned, legitimized, and wielded in the past is never obscure, he said, his gaze holding hers. It's a blueprint. Now, this dagger you're installing. He gestured toward her workstation, closing the distance further. The pattern on the blade. It's not merely decorative, is it? They talked for 20 minutes. About the dagger, about the trade routes that brought such weapons north, about the political assassinations they might have facilitated. His questions were incisive, his knowledge vast but never showy. He listened to her answers with a concentration so absolute it felt like a form of reverence. When a clap of thunder echoed outside, shaking the great windows, they both started slightly, realizing the outside world still existed. It seems the weather has turned from melancholic to militant, he observed, glancing toward the streaming windows. My driver is just outside. May I offer you a ride home? It would be a poor repayment for the private lecture, but it would spare you a drenching. Every instinct of caution, every voice that whispered about the unknown, was drowned out by the sheer magnetic pull of his attention. He was an event horizon. She felt herself nodding before she had fully decided. That would be very kind. The ride was in a car so silent it seemed to swallow the sound of the storm. He asked about her career, her interests, steering clear of anything obviously personal, yet drawing her out with an effortless skill. He spoke of art collections and philosophy, and when he mentioned a passion for restoring neglected architectural gems, his voice carried a genuine warmth. He was, she thought, a man of immense depth, layers upon layers beneath that controlled exterior. The car stopped outside her modest apartment building, a stark contrast to the vehicle's opulence. He handed her a discreet black umbrella. "Until next time, Raina Foster." It wasn't a question. The next time was dinner 2 nights later, at a small, exclusive restaurant where the waiters seemed to breathe only when he glanced away. He was a perfect gentleman, his manners old-world and impeccable. Yet, his intensity never wavered. He watched her mouth as she spoke, noted the way she held her wine glass, and when his hand brushed hers reaching for the salt, a current, sharp and hot, jolted up her arm. He spoke of a childhood spent between boarding schools and empty mansions, of building his empire from modest beginnings, a phrase he delivered with a wryness that hinted at a darkness he wouldn't yet name. She, in turn, found herself speaking of her parents, not of their deaths, but of their lives, of her father's love of history and her mother's skill as a restorer of old texts. "They sound like remarkable people," he said, and for a fleeting second, she saw something in his eyes that looked like genuine pain. To lose that so young, it forges you in a particular fire. Makes you value what is real, what endures. It was the closest either had come to the chasm of her grief, and instead of pushing her away, his words felt like a bridge. The connection was terrifying in its speed and its power. Over the next 2 weeks, he was relentless in his pursuit, not with grand, public gestures, but with a constant, focused attention that felt overwhelming. Flowers arrived not with generic notes, but with lines of poetry that eerily echoed their previous conversations. He secured private after-hours viewings of artifacts for her research. He was a vortex, drawing her in, and she was losing the will to fight the centrifugal force. The invitation to his cliffside estate, the Eyrie, for a weekend arrived on heavy cream cardstock. The final line read, "I would like to show you something that endures." Standing at her window, holding the card, Raina felt the last vestiges of her caution dissolve. The man was an enigma, powerful and undoubtedly dangerous in the way all fundamentally powerful men were. But he saw her, in a way no one had since her parents died. He recognized the mind behind the face, the strength beneath the grief. It was a heady, addictive recognition. The thought of him being the killer of her parents was so astronomically removed from possibility it did not even register as a ghost of a thought. He was salvation, dressed in a suit of shadows. She packed a bag, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, a mix of thrilling fear and desperate hope. She was walking into the lion's den, and all she could feel was the irresistible need to stroke the lion's mane. The Eyrie did not so much occupy the cliff edge as defy it. A monolithic structure of steel, glass, and weathered stone, it seemed to grow from the very rock, a brutalist crown overlooking the furious, gray expanse of the ocean. As the car navigated the final, serpentine approach, Raina felt a profound sense of dislocation. The city, with its familiar grids and muted sorrows, had vanished. Here, there was only the raw edge of the world, and the man who had built his fortress upon it. Darius was waiting at the entrance, foregoing the formality of staff. He looked different, stripped of the city's armor. He wore dark trousers and a simple black sweater that did nothing to soften the lines of his shoulders. The wind tore at his hair, and he made no move to stop it. He was, for the first time, visibly part of the untamed landscape. He smiled as she emerged, a genuine, unguarded expression that momentarily stole her breath. "You came," he said, as if he'd held some doubt. He took her bag himself, his fingers brushing hers, a point of contact that burned even in the salt-stung air. The interior was a study in contrasts. Soaring ceilings and walls of glass made the ocean and sky the primary decor, an ever-changing masterpiece of tempestuous beauty. Yet the furnishings were sparse, severe, deeply rooted in comfort without a hint of frivolity. Everything was of the highest quality, chosen with a ruthlessly discerning eye. It was a space that spoke of absolute control, yet its openness to the elements felt like a controlled vulnerability. "I have something for you," he said, leading her not to a bedroom, but to a west-facing sitting area. On a low table sat a long, narrow box of polished rosewood. Inside, nestled on midnight velvet, was a stylus from the late Roman Empire, its bronze tip still sharp, its shaft intricately worked with a pattern of laurel leaves. I remembered you mentioned your mother worked with ancient texts. This would have been used to inscribe wax tablets. A tool for making stories permanent. It was not extravagance that stunned her, but the terrifying intimacy of the observation. He had listened, he had remembered a fragment of her pain, and he had offered a piece of history to connect to it. Her throat tightened. Darius, it's too much. Nothing is too much, he replied, his voice soft but absolute. Not for you. The weekend unfolded in a surreal, suspended reality. They walked the windswept cliffs, he pointing out geological formations with the same authority he used to discuss stock portfolios. They dined on meals so exquisite they seemed like abstractions, served by a staff that was whisper-quiet and invisible. He spoke of his childhood, a bleak recitation of boarding schools and cold guardians, of learning early that sentiment was a currency that devalued instantly. You build walls, he said, staring into the fire that crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in. Not to keep people out, but to see who cares enough to try and break them down. Most don't. And those who do, she asked, curled in a chair opposite him, a glass of amber cognac warming her hands. His gray eyes found hers in the flickering light. They become everything. The physical progression was inevitable. It began with touches that lingered, a hand on the small of her back guiding her through a doorway, fingers brushing her hair from her face as the wind gusted. It was a courtship of deliberate, escalating possession. The first time he kissed her, it was against the floor-to-ceiling window, the storm-lashed ocean a chaos at their backs. His mouth was demanding, yet laced with a reverence that unmoored her. He tasted of salt and dark spice. When he finally led her to his bedroom, a cavernous space dominated by a low platform bed and the endless ocean view, there was no pretense of hesitation. His lovemaking was like the man himself, intense, controlled, devastatingly thorough. He learned her body with the same focus he applied to a business acquisition, mapping her responses, cataloging the sounds she made, the places where her breath hitched. It was overwhelming, a total annihilation of self that felt, in the moment, like a form of transcendence. Afterward, wrapped in the silence and the scent of him, she felt a perilous peace. This, she thought wildly, is what it is to be known. To be claimed. Yet, cracks in the idyll began to appear, fine as hairline fractures in glass. The sheer scale of his security detail, men with watchful eyes and silent communications earpieces who blended into the shadows of the house. A phone call he took in his study one evening, she passed the door, left ajar, and heard the calm, utterly devoid of emotion, in his voice as he said, "Handle it. Permanently." The words were ambiguous, but the ice in his tone was not. When he emerged, his face was a smooth mask, but his knuckles were white. And then there was the locked wing. A heavy, reinforced door at the end of the east corridor, secured by a biometric scanner. "Archives," he said dismissively when she asked, his arm around her shoulders already turning her away. "Boring financial records. The detritus of empire." But his dismissal was too swift, his body a subtle barrier between her and the door. The curiosity, once seated, became a gnawing thing. It warred with the languid satisfaction of his attention, with the addictive drug of his touch. On their final morning, under the guise of exploring, she found herself before the door again. The house was preternaturally quiet. Darius was in a video conference in his main study. A wild, reckless thought took hold. She had seen him use the scanner. She remembered the sequence of his movements, the angle of his hand. Holding her breath, she reached out and mimicked the motion, pressing her own palm against the cool glass. A red light blinked. A denial. Of course. She felt a fool, and a surge of shameful relief. But as she turned to go, her sleeve caught on a slight imperfection in the wall paneling. A small, almost invisible access port for maintenance, its cover slightly ajar. Inside, amidst a nest of wires, was a manual override, a simple, physical key switch, an emergency failsafe. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum of betrayal. This was his space. His trust. She threw the switch. The lock disengaged with a soft, hydraulic hiss. The door swung inward a few inches, revealing not an archive, but a dimly lit, windowless room. It was an inner sanctum, a true office. The air was still and cool. A massive desk of fossilized stone dominated the space. The walls were not for art, but for information, large, digital frames displayed real-time data streams, maps with glowing points, financial tickers. It was a command center. Her eyes, however, were drawn to the far wall. A more traditional site, a large pinboard, covered in what looked like aged documents, photographs, and newspaper clippings. A personal project. Drawn forward by a dread she could not name, she stepped inside. The photographs were of her parents. There they were, caught in grainy telephoto shots, her father laughing on the steps of the courthouse, her mother carrying groceries, their images marked with timestamps from a year before their deaths. Police reports were neatly annotated in a sharp, familiar hand. Coroner's diagrams. And at the center, a single sheet of crisp, professional letterhead. It was an order. A memorandum of understanding for a business transaction requiring complete asset liquidation. The targets were listed by name, address, occupation. The objective, permanent resolution to ensure operational security. At the bottom, a signature, bold and unwavering, the ink seeming barely dry after 10 years. It was not the signature of Darius, the enigmatic lover. It was the full, legal signature of the architect, Victor Thorne. The world did not so much shatter as delaminate. The foundation of the last few weeks, the touch, the words, the profound sense of being seen, slid away, revealing a black, abysmal truth. The taste of his kiss turned to ash in her memory. The feel of his hands, now instruments of this verdict. The cold calculation in this room was the real man. The one in the other wing, who whispered endearments into her hair, was the artifact. A beautifully crafted fake. She heard it then, the deliberate, measured tread of footsteps on the hardwood floor in the corridor outside. Approaching the study. Approaching her. The rhythm was unhurried, assured. He knew she was here. The door was open. The evidence was in her hands, her scent in his air. She stood, paralyzed, the damning paper trembling in her grip, as the footsteps stopped just behind her in the open doorway. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, before his voice, flat and devoid of all the warmth she had come to crave, finally broke it. Raina. It was not a question. It was an indictment. The silence that followed her name was not empty, it was a solid, living thing, filling the room with the weight of collapsed histories. Raina did not turn. She could not. Her body was a column of ice, her gaze locked on the damning signature, her vision blurring the stark black lines into a Rorschach blot of betrayal. She felt his presence in the doorway like a shift in atmospheric pressure, a storm contained within a human frame. He moved then, not with the predatory swiftness she expected, but with a slow, almost weary deliberation. He circled around her, his movements silent on the thick carpet, coming to stand behind the fossilized stone desk. He did not look at the board, at the photographs of her parents. His eyes, that flint gray now hardened to slag, remained fixed on her. He leaned back against the desk, crossing his arms, a portrait of chilling composure. The man who had kissed her with desperate hunger hours before was gone, erased. In his place was the Kingpin, the architect. Victor. You were never supposed to see this room, he said, his voice conversational, as though discussing a minor breach of etiquette. It was the calm that was most monstrous. There was no rage, no frantic justification. Only a terrible, accepting finality. The sound of his voice unlocked her paralysis. A raw, wounded sound tore from her throat, part sob, part scream. She flung the paper at him. It fluttered, a useless white bird, and landed at his feet. You, she choked out, the words scraping her throat raw. It was you. All this time. You knew who I was. From the moment you approached the Venetian dagger display, he confirmed, his head tilting slightly. Due diligence is the foundation of any enterprise. You were a loose end, albeit a beautifully crafted one. A potential risk that needed to be assessed and contained. Contained? The word was a shriek, echoing in the sterile room. You murdered them. You signed their death warrant like it was a stock transfer. Her body trembled violently, the horror giving way to a torrent of fractured images, his hands on her skin, his lips whispering promises against her ear, all while he carried the knowledge of her parents' blood on his conscience. The cognitive dissonance was a physical agony. It was a business decision, he stated, the phrase so sterile it sucked the air from the room. Your parents were exceptional journalists. They uncovered a nexus of financial channels that would have toppled everything I'd built. They were given a chance to walk away, with substantial compensation. They chose idealism. He paused, his gaze never leaving her shattered face. In my world, such a choice has a single, inevitable consequence. I do not regret the decision. It ensured the survival and growth of what you see around you. He gestured vaguely, encompassing the estate, his empire. The sheer, unvarnished truth of it was a blow more brutal than any lie. He did not insult her by denying it. He offered her the monstrous reality and dared her to comprehend it. "You're a monster," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Perhaps," he conceded, uncrossing his arms and standing to his full height. "But I am a monster who fell in love with you." The statement hung in the air, more shocking than the confession of murder. It was a perverse, twisted cord thrown across the abyss between them. His expression shifted, the absolute control fracturing for a microsecond, revealing a yawning need so profound it was terrifying. "My initial intent was to monitor you. To ensure the past remained buried. But you with your sharp mind and your defiant eyes, grieving ghosts you couldn't name. You dismantled me, Reina. Piece by piece. What I feel for you is the only real, uncalculated thing I have possessed in 2 decades. Don't you say that." She stumbled back, hitting the edge of the pinboard, photographs rattling. "Don't you dare use that word. You brought me here. You touched me. You made me love a ghost." The last word was a wail of utter desolation. "You are not the only one haunted," he said, his voice dropping, gaining a rough, emotional texture that felt more dangerous than his calm. "I am haunted by the living. By you. Every moment with you has been a war between what I built and what you make me want to be. A war I am losing." He took a step toward her. She flinched violently. He stopped, a pained acknowledgement flashing in his eyes. "You cannot leave," he said, and it was no longer a confession but a decree. "You know too much. Not just about the past, but about me. The man behind the wall. That knowledge is a death sentence anywhere outside my protection. And I will not, let you go." The finality of it settled over her, a shroud heavier than grief. This was not a negotiation. It was a sentencing. The gilded weekend was over. The cage door had just shut with a silent, definitive click. The days that followed were a study in psychological dismantling. She was not thrown into a dungeon. Her prison was the very opulence that had seduced her. She remained in the beautiful guest suite, but the doors were electronically locked from the outside. A discreet but ever-present guard stood at the end of the corridor. Darius, she could not think of him as Victor, it was a bridge too far, visited her with a terrible regularity. His approach was a dual assault. There were moments of cold, brutal honesty. He would speak of his operations, the mechanics of power, the necessary violence, as if educating her, forcing her to see the world through his lens. "Sentiment is a luxury afforded to those who do not hold the reins," he told her one evening, standing at the window of her room as she sat rigid on the bed. "Your parents paid for that luxury with their lives. I am offering you a different choice. Understand the darkness. Rule from within it. Rule beside me." Interwoven with these chilling lessons were moments of tender, devastating intimacy. He would bring her meals himself, foods he had noticed she favored. He would talk about her mother's work, drawing out details Reina had shared in a different life, showing a memory that was achingly precise. He would sit in silence with her, sharing the space without touching, his presence an inescapable fact. And sometimes, in the deep silence of the night, he would enter her room. He would not speak. He would simply lie beside her on the bed, his body a line of heat against her back, his face buried in her hair. He would breathe her in, his arms wrapping around her with a desperation that felt genuine, a child clinging to a single source of light in a black universe. She would lie rigid, tears streaming silently into the pillow, hating him, hating the treacherous part of her that still thrilled to his nearness, the part that remembered the man before she knew the monster. A week after her discovery, he presented her with a box. It was not rosewood, but polished obsidian. "This is not a gift," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It is a condition of your continued safety here." Inside, on a bed of black silk, lay a necklace. It was a masterpiece of captive beauty. A cascade of perfectly matched paved diamonds formed a collar, sleek and modern, centered by a teardrop-shaped gem of a deep, smoky gray quartz that matched his eyes exactly. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly chilling. "It is unclaspable without the magnetic key," he explained, his voice devoid of inflection. "It is also fitted with a delicate pressure sensor and a locator. An attempt to remove it by force, or to travel beyond the geo-fenced boundaries of the estate, will trigger an immediate response." He lifted it from the box. The diamonds caught the light, scattering cold, bright shards across the walls. "You will wear it. Always." Revulsion choked her. "I won't." "You will." He moved behind her. She stiffened, but did not fight as he placed the cool metal and stones against her throat. There was a soft, definitive click as the magnetic seal engaged. It was not heavy, but its presence was an intolerable weight, a constant, exquisite pressure on her collarbones. He turned her to face a mirror. The reflection was a grotesque parody. Her face was pale, shadows under her eyes. The necklace, a glittering marvel of craftsmanship, looked like what it was, a slave collar. A brand. His hands rested on her shoulders, his tall frame looming behind her, his gaze locking with hers in the glass. "You see," he murmured, his breath stirring her hair. His voice was a complex tapestry of possession, triumph, and a despair so deep it seemed bottomless. "You hate me. You will likely hate me more with each passing day. But you are mine." His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly. "And I am, irrevocably, yours. We are bound now, Reina. By the past. By the truth. And by this." In the mirror, she watched a single tear escape, tracing a path through the dust of her shattered life. It rolled down her cheek, hung for a moment on her jaw, and fell, disappearing against the cold, brilliant diamonds. The necklace became her new skin. In the first days, its touch was a constant, searing reminder, a brand of ownership, a monument to her naivete, and a chain linking her directly to the man who had orchestrated her ruin. She would catch her reflection in the dark glass of a window or the polished surface of a faucet and see a stranger, a pale woman adorned with captured starlight, her eyes holding a darkness that had not been there before. The initial, raw horror began to mutate, tempered by the sheer, grinding necessity of survival. Hysterics, she understood with a cold clarity, would achieve nothing but her own depletion. To live, to even begin to think of escape, she would have to navigate the impossible labyrinth of his affection and his ruthlessness. Her performance began subtly. She stopped flinching when he entered the room. She ceased the silent, glaring defiance and allowed her gaze to become distant, resigned. She began to eat the meals he brought, forcing down bites under his watchful eyes. One evening, as he spoke again of the necessary structures of his power, she interrupted, her voice flat but clear. "Explain the currency laundering through the Baltic galleries. The method you mentioned last week. I don't understand the shell company progression." He had stared at her, a flicker of profound surprise breaking his impassive mask. Then, slowly, a dark, approving light kindled in his eyes. He took a seat and explained. It was a test, for both of them. Her willingness to engage with the machinery of his damnation was a narcotic to him, a sign of capitulation. For her, it was the first step into the belly of the beast. Their physical interactions became the most treacherous terrain. He would come to her at night, a shadow slipping into her bed. She learned to school her body, to offer not the passionate responsiveness he had once known, but a pliant, melancholy acceptance. She turned her face away when he kissed her, but she did not push him away. She let his hands rediscover her, each touch a violation she meticulously recorded in a hidden ledger of her mind. In the aftermath, when he would hold her, his face buried against her neck beside the cold diamonds, his breaths deep and shuddering, she would lie perfectly still, her mind as sharp and clear as a shard of ice. She noted the names he mumbled in his sleep, rivals, associates, cities. She catalogued the times he received encrypted calls, the patterns of his movements, the faint tension that entered his shoulders when he spoke of a rival named Silas Rourke. Rourke's name became a recurring motif in his monologues. A brash, ambitious newcomer leveraging destabilizing tactics, unchecked violence on the streets, attacks on legitimate Thorn businesses. He mistakes chaos for power, Darius would sneer, but the sneer lacked its usual certainty. Rourke was a wild variable, a man without the patina of legacy or restraint, and therefore, dangerously unpredictable. The outside world filtered in through carefully controlled channels, a single, monitored news program on the wall screen in her sitting area. It was during a segment on a series of arsons at downtown warehouses she now knew were Thorn Holdings, that she saw him. A man in the crowd of onlookers, his face weathered, his posture tense. Jonah Miller. Her father's friend, the man who had stood at the graveside, a steadying hand on her teenage shoulder. The sight was a bolt of pure, undiluted oxygen to a woman suffocating. He was alive. He was here. And he was looking. A plan, fragile and terrifying, began to crystallize. She needed to communicate. The estate was a digital fortress, any device she was given was a honeypot. Her opportunity came during one of the rare, escorted walks on the grounds. A member of the groundskeeping staff, a young man who always averted his eyes from her, was trimming a hedge near the cliff path. As she passed, her guard a few paces behind, she let the heavy, jade bracelet Darius had given her, another beautiful shackle, slip from her wrist. It tumbled into the thick boxwood. She stopped, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of distress. "My bracelet," she said, her voice laced with a convincingly genuine upset. The guard sighed, annoyed, and bent to look. For 3 seconds, his back was turned. Raina's eyes met the groundskeeper's. She mouthed 2 words, the name she had seen on her father's old case files, Jonah Miller. Then, with a subtle flick of her fingers, she dropped a tightly folded note, a grocery list she had prepared for this moment, the letters JM hidden in the script. The young man's eyes widened in sheer terror, but he gave an almost imperceptible nod before looking furiously back at his shears. It took a week of breathless, agonizing waiting. Then, during a tedious charity gala Darius forced her to attend at the city's opera house, a display of his normal life, her diamond collar gleaming under the chandeliers, the connection was made. In the opulent, perfumed chaos of the ladies' lounge, a attendant pressed a folded paper towel into her hand along with a fresh towel. In the stall, her hands trembling, Raina unfolded it. A single line, in a familiar, careful hand, * the old place. Tuesday, 3 p.m. Be seen at the South Terrace. * the old place. Their old meeting spot, a bench near the museum where her father and Jonah would talk. Getting seen was its own intricate dance. On Tuesday, she expressed a sudden, wistful desire for sunlight on a particular south-facing terrace, a place she knew was in view of a public hiking trail across a deep ravine. She wore a cream-colored dress at Darius's suggestion. It would catch the light, he said. He approved the excursion, a reward for her recent improvement. As she stood at the stone balustrade, the wind tugging at her dress, the necklace a cold weight, she felt utterly exposed. She did not wave, did not make any signal. She simply stood, a portrait of solitary contemplation, for exactly 15 minutes. She prayed the binoculars were trained on her. The exchange of information became a perilous ballet. Messages arrived via the groundskeeper, hidden in the soil of a new orchid plant delivered to her rooms, slipped under the rim of a food platter. She had no device, so she wrote her intelligence in a tiny, precise script on the thin, sturdy paper of the book jackets in her gilded prison, tearing off strips to be smuggled out. She reported shipment routes for Thorne's legitimate shipping arm, which Jonah could cross-reference for irregularities. She listed the names of key lieutenants she overheard. She detailed the security shift changes at the Eyrie, the blind spots in the camera coverage along the eastern cliff face, knowledge Darius himself had casually pointed out, believing he was sharing secrets with his consort. The greatest risk was the necklace itself. She dared not try to remove it, but she could describe its mechanism. She lived in a state of perpetual, high-wire tension, her every word to Darius a carefully constructed lie, her every moment alone spent listening for footsteps, her sleep haunted by the fear of his discovery. The strain forged a new version of her. The grieving curator was gone, buried under layers of performative submission and calculated deceit. In her place was a creature of sharp edges and colder blood. She found she could meet Darius's gaze during the day and discuss the morality of realpolitik, then lay beside him at night, her mind replaying the sound of his voice ordering her parents' deaths. The duality was a sickness, and it was also her armor. The catalyst came during a late-night meeting Darius held in his study, believing her asleep. She listened at the adjoining door, her ear pressed to the cold wood. His voice was tight, a wire about to snap. Rourke has the manifest from the Nordic Star, he bit out. If he decrypts it and goes public, the customs investigation alone will collapse the holding company. The Star docks at Pier 41 at dawn, day after tomorrow. The data core must be retrieved before Rourke's men can intercept. This is not a preference, it is an existential imperative. It was the clearest, most actionable intelligence she had gleaned. The Nordic Star, Pier 41, dawn in 2 days. A location, a time, a critical asset. She committed it to memory, the words burning like a brand. This was more than a shipment, this was a potential killing blow, one that could gut Darius's operations and create the chaos in which an escape might be possible. As she silently crept back to bed, her heart hammering against the diamonds at her throat, she understood the next phase. Jonah would need to act on this, and he would need to do so in a way that did not merely steal the data core, but that sparked the war between Thorne and Rourke. In the fire of that conflict, a prisoner might slip away, or a kingpin might fall. She lay down, the space beside her still empty. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to plan. The woman in the mirror with the diamond collar was now a double agent, her love a weapon, her grief a fuel, playing the most dangerous game imaginable on a board where every square was owned by the man she was destined to destroy. The information, passed through the fragile, terrifying pipeline she had built, detonated in the silent world with the force of a seismic charge. Reyna did not witness the raid on the Nordic Star Pier, but she felt its aftershocks. Darius's return to the area in the pre-dawn gloom of the following day was a study in contained cataclysm. The usual, silent grace of his movements was replaced by a stiff, vibrating tension. He did not come to her rooms. Instead, she heard the distant, muffled crash of something expensive shattering against the stone wall of his study. The entire house seemed to hold its breath, the staff moving like ghosts, their eyes wide with a fear more potent than any she had seen before. The data core had not just been stolen, its theft had been a public, violent spectacle that left 3 of his men dead and, according to the carefully worded news alert that flashed on her screen, initiated a sweeping federal inquiry into port security protocols. Silas Rourke, in a brazen statement, had taken credit for exposing systemic corruption, positioning himself as a chaotic alternative to Thorne's old guard rule. Darius's world was cracking. He came for her at noon. The door to her room did not open, it was breached. The electronic lock emitted a sharp, overridden shriek before he appeared in the doorway. The impeccable mask was gone. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed pools of a fury so deep it verged on agony. In his hand, he held a single, torn slip of the distinctive book jacket paper she used. It was the manifest note for the Nordic Star. Jonah must have left it behind as a deliberate, taunting signature. He did not speak. He simply crossed the room, the silence more threatening than any roar, and hauled her from the chair by her arm. His grip was brutal, fingers digging into the bone, as he dragged her through the corridors, down into the heart of the estate, to his fortified study. He threw her inside. She stumbled, catching herself on the cold stone of his desk. The wall of screens was a chaotic ballet of red alerts and financial nosedives. "Explain this." His voice was a raw scrape, holding the note out, the paper trembling minutely in his air. Every rehearsed lie, every fragment of her performance, evaporated under the sheer, radioactive heat of his betrayal. She straightened, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, she let him see it all, the loathing, the calculation, the triumph. She said nothing. His composure shattered. He backhanded her across the face. The blow was stunning, a white flash of pain that sent her reeling, the metallic taste of blood flooding her mouth. "I offered you a kingdom," he roared, the sound tearing from him. "I offered you myself. I tore out my own entrails for you. And you whore, you viper." He grabbed her again, shaking her, the diamonds of the necklace biting into her throat. "You were my only truth. And you were my only lie," she spat, blood on her lips. "From the first word. You killed my truth. I am just returning the favor." The raw, gutted pain in his eyes was more terrifying than his rage. It was the look of a man watching his only temple crumble to dust. He released her as if burned, turning away, his shoulders heaving. "I should kill you for this," he whispered, but the words held no conviction, only a bottomless despair. It was then that the world outside exploded. The first blast was a deep, concussive whump that shook the foundations, raining dust from the ceiling. Alarms erupted, a screaming, multitonal cacophony. The screens flashed with exterior camera feeds showing men in tactical gear swarming the perimeter gates, muzzle flashes lighting up the twilight. Silas Rourke had not been content with a financial wound. He had come for the heart. Chaos, absolute and consuming, swallowed the estate. Darius's head snapped up, the personal cataclysm instantly subsumed by the immediate threat. The Kingpin reasserted himself, cold and lethal. He yanked open a panel in the stone wall, revealing a sleek arsenal. He armed himself, his movements reverting to deadly efficiency. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice flat now, the emotion sealed away behind a wall of operational necessity. "The room is reinforced. It will hold." But it did not hold. The assault was too focused, too informed. Rourke's men knew the weak points, weak points, the ones she had detailed in her notes. Within minutes, the heavy door shuddered under the impact of shaped explosives. With a deafening roar, it blew inward. Darius moved like a demon. He cut down the first two men through the door with terrifying precision. The room filled with smoke, gunfire, and shouts. Reyna crouched behind the desk, debris stinging her skin. She saw a man take aim at Darius from the shattered doorway. Without thought, acting on an impulse that horrifically spliced instinct with a debt she refused to name, she screamed a warning. He spun, firing, and the attacker fell. Their eyes met across the smoke-choked room, a flash of stunned, mutual incomprehension. A second, closer explosion from the east wing rocked the estate. A support beam cracked, and part of the ceiling gave way, trapping Darius under a cascade of stone and twisted metal. He cried out, leg pinned, his weapon skittering out of reach. From the smoke, Silas Rourke himself emerged, a brutish man with a smile of pure, gleeful malice, advancing on the helpless Kingpin, his pistol raised for the coup de grace. "Leave him." The words left Reyna's lips before she could cage them. She stepped out from behind the desk. Rourke's aim wavered, shifting to her. "The little bird. You're the one who gave us the keys." "I did," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "And I am leaving. But he is not your trophy to take." She looked at Darius, pinned and bleeding, his gray eyes burning into hers with a maelstrom of agony, pride, and something she dared not define. "His sentence is not a quick death. It is this." She gestured to the burning ruins of his sanctuary, the screams of his dying empire. "It is living in the ashes of what he built and knowing I walked out of them." Rourke laughed, a coarse, ugly sound. "Sentimental bitch. I'll take both trophies." A shot rang out, not from Rourke's gun, but from the shattered doorway. Rourke jerked, a bloom of red appearing on his chest. He looked down, shocked, then collapsed. Standing in the ruin of the door, smoke swirling around him, was Jonah Miller, a pistol gripped tight in his hand, his face grim and resolute. Reyna. Now. This was the moment. The pivot point of her life. She walked toward Jonah, past the trapped Darius. His hand shot out, bloody fingers closing around her ankle with surprising strength. His touch was a brand. She stopped, looking down at him. The fury was gone. The Kingpin was gone. All that remained was a man in ruins, clinging to the last, fragile piece of his world. "Don't," he pleaded, the words stripped bare, raw as an open nerve. "Please." She looked at him, the architect of her nightmares, the lover who had shown her a perverse kind of heaven within hell. She saw the order he had signed, felt the ghost of his kisses, heard the desperate truth in his confessions. The hatred and the twisted love performed a final, annihilating dance inside her. They canceled each other out, leaving only a vast, quiet certainty. "My parents' death was your sentence," she said, her voice hollow with finality. "This." She looked around at the consuming fire, the fallen rival, the end of his dominion. "This burning world is your prison. I will not carry you with me." She bent down. Not to kiss him. Not to offer comfort. With cold, precise fingers, she found the almost invisible seam of the necklace. Using the small, magnetic key she had stolen from his dressing table weeks ago, a sliver of metal she had kept hidden, a hope made physical, she pressed it to the clasp at the nape of her neck. There was a soft, decisive click. The exquisite pressure vanished. She lifted the glittering collar, the diamonds, and the smoky quartz stone now just dead weight in her palm. She placed it carefully on his chest, over his heart. A returned crown. A finalized contract. His fingers slipped from her ankle. She turned and walked to Jonah, who wrapped a steadying arm around her shoulders. She did not look back as he guided her through the carnage, past the firefights that still sparked in the hallways, out through a shattered service entrance into the chaotic, liberating night. Sirens wailed in the distance, approaching. The cold, clean air of the cliff top hit her face, scoured of smoke and perfume and his scent. She was free. The diamonds were gone, but their ghostly impression remained on her skin, a pale, cool band like a memory of frost. She was free, but she knew, with a certainty that would last a lifetime, that no matter how far she ran, she would forever walk with the shadow of the man who had loved her with a murderer's heart, and the echo of the woman who had loved him back. The story of Reina and Darius is a tale of poisoned roots and impossible blossoms. If you crave narratives where love walks hand in hand with betrayal, where redemption is a ghost and passion is a weapon, then journey deeper into the shadows. Subscribe. More tales of dark devotion and shattered loyalties await.